Hello, and thanks for joining us today here on the Happiness Quest. My name is Jess Dutel from the Center for Business and Community Partnerships at Plymouth State University and from the PEMU Center, thanks to our Service Learning Partnership.
And I'm Dr. Maria Sanders, a philosophy professor over at Plymouth State University and the CEO for Philosophy for Life. And on today's program, we're going to focus on the question of whether or not money can buy happiness. And I thought, what better way to start than to look at this thing we call money?
Yes.
So I've got a few things for us to take a look at.
Some props, okay.
This first one, very common, the $1 bill. Probably one of the most common bills, but maybe not in this fashion, where it's in a sheet. Have you seen these printed out?
I haven't. This is my first time seeing them.
Okay, yeah, this is actually directly from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, who prints our money in Washington, D.C. for us.
And you got your hands on them.
I have my hands on one, but this actually is already cut. Can you guess how many $1 bills they would print on a single sheet?
Oh my goodness. So much more than 4.
A lot more than 4.
50?
You're right. You're
Really?
right. Used to be 32.
So exciting.
Yeah, but now it's 50.
And we
so-
didn't practice that.
No, we did. You got that right on there. But it's interesting because we were talking last time about moderation and finding that point of balance. And even with printing money, there's a point of balance. If you think about how inflation and deflation works, if they print too much money, it inflates the value. So basically, we get less for our dollar. So we can see where that's not a good thing.
Right.
But we may not think so much about if they print too little money. That sounds like a good thing. You know, it's like, well, then my dollar's worth more, I can buy more. But that's actually not a good thing either, because what happens, people start to hold on to the actual dollar rather than putting it into investments or purchasing things. So the value becomes, rather than an instrument or a tool, but in the thing itself, the value becomes there. So as we think about whether or not this can actually buy happiness, you know, can this make me happy? It's interesting to think about how we take particular pieces of paper and give them additional value that they just didn't have prior to that.
And that is ingrained in us from childhood, our beliefs about money. And I wanted to share just a quick story because last weekend we went to the stores in Tilton. We were going to the outlets and we were in one of the stores and my 5-year-old saw a sweater. Now the sweater was $30 and I said, sweetheart, you know, let's go look at the clearance rack and look at all these beautiful items you can get from $2 to $5. How exciting is that? But she wanted this $30 sweater. And of course, she's going to outgrow it in a month, right? So it just wasn't worth it. And trying to explain to her the value in that. And she said, but Mama, you can use your card and then you don't have to pay any money.
Well, and that's interesting when you think of the credit cards. I can remember my oldest son when he was about 8. Christmas time was coming around and they're making their Christmas list, and he finished really quickly. He came and he had one item on it. He wanted a credit card. Because he had figured out that you could just take this card and get anything you want. So all the toys and so the whole credit thing, it takes a little longer, I think, for them to understand how that credit works. You're still going to have to pay for it.
We had a little conversation about that, but she thought she had the solution.
Well, and it is interesting when you think about like things being put on sale. You know, the value of that dollar and what it can purchase. The dollar itself isn't always driving that. Sometimes it's on the product side, you know, what drives it. So this one's my favorite, the $2 bill. These are actually still produced and they're still in circulation, although they're much less common than the $1 bill. The $2 bill, if you wanted to get these today, you'd probably have to order them at your bank. But we always use them frequently for tipping because it had a uniqueness to it.
Oh, absolutely.
And it has a unique history behind it as well, because these were actually originally produced for the security of the country. And they were taken out of circulation for a while, and that's why they're quite rare now. Even though they have started producing them again, they don't produce them anywhere near in the quantity that, say, the 1s or the 5s or the 10s.
The Tooth Fairy brings 2s to our house.
Well, they have I hear a direct connection with the $2 bill. Yeah, they do it at our house,
we see them sometimes.
Although at times they'd rather the Tooth Fairy knew the $5 bill than the 2, but they know the $2 bill. Well, how about this one? This is, again, looks like a $1 bill. I'll give you a closer inspection of it. Anything unusual or unique about
Well, the blue seal.
Yeah, if we look back at, well, this is the 2. Let me grab the 1 here. If we look back at the $1 bill and put that one up alongside of it, one thing that jumps out is the color difference. But you'll also notice at the very top up here, the top of this one, it just says Federal Reserve note.
This is a silver certificate.
It's a silver certificate. And again, these are unique because the silver certificates were actually produced in response to the Western silver mining interest. They were upset that the United States was backing all their currency with gold. And so originally, you could turn these back in and redeem them for actual silver. And it was in the government vaults. Can't do that anymore. But they have become quite rare because, again, they've been taken out of circulation. They didn't print steadily, although they were brought back into the printing scheme for the bicentennial in 1976. But beyond that, they printed for a while. You cannot redeem them for silver anymore. They've become more of a collector's item than anything. And we usually don't spend the silver certificates, although you could. It would spend like a $1 bill. Then my last one, since we're talking about silver, this is the 1964 Kennedy silver half dollar. And again, this is the last full 100% silver half dollar. They did produce a few of them in the following years that were like 40% silver. But this one, even though it has a face value of 50 cents, it's actually worth closer to about $15 because of its silver content. And so I share all of these to start our discussion on whether or not this stuff can bring happiness. Because when you think about it, going back to the just standard $1 bill, we use this like a tool. It would be probably unusual to collect it because it's so common. It's used for its instrumental value. But then suddenly, as you get into silver certificates and silver coins,
and the $2 bills,
bills, as it becomes rarer, it almost takes on a different context where it still has instrumental value. We could still use these things to purchase other things, but they start to have a value in and of themselves. And it turns from just using it to buy material things to more of an experience of sorts. And I think that's at the heart of what we want to talk about today. So you mentioned a little story with your daughter. I guess I'm curious, in general, we have a relationship that develops with money. How was money presented to you as a child? Was it a positive thing or a negative thing?
Well, it was positive in terms of my own purchase power. So I was given chores, I was given an allowance, I was taught, the value of money. But what was unspoken, I think, has struck me the most in my adulthood, and that was I have 2 incredible parents who worked so hard at their careers, but they never loved their work. And I knew that from a very young age. They would come home and they weren't happy at what they were doing. They didn't find any significant purpose or meaning, but they were providing for my little brother and I, and that was what was important to them. And so we went on vacations, we had everything provided that we needed, but I did see that my parents didn't necessarily love going to work. And so as a result, I had this belief that in order to make money that you needed to survive, you had to work, and that might not be fun. And then as an adult, I made the choice, well, I want to love what I do. I want to find purpose and meaning in my career. And so I went into the nonprofit sector, which interestingly enough is notorious for people not making a lot of money. But I thought, isn't it more important to love what I'm doing and invest into what I'm doing so that I have fulfillment and meaning?
But it's interesting that you felt that was a choice. It was one or the other.
But I thought it was a choice until there was a shift in my relationship with money and with career when I thought, oh wait, why does it have to be one or the other? I could find purpose and I could get the money and the earnings that I need to live the life that I want to live with my family and provide for my children and go on those vacations. But until that shift took place in my own mind and in my relationship with the money, I lived paycheck to paycheck thinking, well, I traded the salary for the purpose and meaning. So I found that interesting.
It is interesting. And, and I went through something probably similar. When I was first going to college, I went for philosophy. Philosophy, again, was notorious for having this reputation that you probably wouldn't work at all, but if you did, you weren't going to work for a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so I had taken a philosophy of law class and absolutely loved it. Well, lawyers make money. Right. And so instantly I thought, well, okay, I really like what I'm doing in philosophy, but I think I'll also go to law school. And that was actually my motivation to become a lawyer initially, was that'll put food on the table so that I can do what I love in philosophy. And ironically, I did practice law for over a decade in the Midwest, and now I still do consulting and that. But law has always been, with the exception of about 10 years of my life, the secondary income for me. It's always been kind of the backdrop that I never was unemployed in philosophy. And I think some of it is the passion of doing what you love comes through.
Absolutely. And when you do what you love, of course the earnings are going to come because you're going to be good at it. But I remember when I was working on my MBA, some people said, why are you doing this to go into the nonprofit sector? And I thought, because that's where my heart is. My heart is in the nonprofit sector. And yet there is this perception that people who work for nonprofit organizations are struggling financially. And that doesn't have to be the case, but that's a belief that we hold. And so it's interesting to me, the beliefs that we take on, that we adopt. And again, this was nothing that was spoken to me as a child. This was just my observations of the world around me. And then I took that on for myself.
Yeah, and I have to admit, it was actually spoken. We heard many times growing up, you can't buy happiness. You're going to have to go to work, but work wasn't equated with happiness. Work, by its very definition, is something you're probably not going to be happy at, but it's a necessary evil, so to speak, so that you can do the things with your family and your loved ones that you want to do that will bring you happiness. And they really were handled almost like exclusive categories. And I'm very pleased to say that my experience with work has been the opposite of that, that I've held some jobs I enjoyed more than others, but I have also walked off of very high-paying jobs for lower-paying jobs because I liked the lifestyle that it brought holistically, and it wasn't about just the dollar amount.
And that's important, and it's always been important to me that my children see me happy in what I'm
modeling
doing.
the behavior all the time.
Yeah.
Well, and it reminds me of an ancient Greek philosopher, Diogenes. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
I have it just now.
Okay, he's not one of the more popular ones. Usually it's Socrates or Plato or Aristotle. But Diogenes was an interesting character. His father minted currency. And Diogenes never followed in his father's footsteps. Instead, he was actually quite critical of what was the beginning of a consumeristic society developing. He felt that we should return to the more simplistic styles that nature offered us models of. And so he would debase money on a regular basis. And because of that, his original hometown was a town called Sinope. He was banished from Sinope, which today would be in Turkey, to give you a geographic location. So he was banished, and he wasn't allowed to return. And so he headed to Athens. And it's in Athens that we end up learning a lot about Diogenes, because the Athenians were, well, they prided themselves with being the cultural hub of their time period. So they captured a lot of the stories. And to give you a little background on Diogenes, this is someone who pretty much gave up his material possessions when he moved to Athens. He did have a wooden bowl. We know about the wooden bowl because he ends up eventually giving that up as well. He lived in a clay pot in the marketplace, where, again, very visible because they would come daily. They didn't have the refrigeration systems in that, so the marketplace became the general hub. He was known for carrying a lit lantern around during the day. And when people would ask him, it's like, why do you have a lantern? He's like, well, I'm on a search for an honest person. And so he was a very eccentric character, to say the least. Quest. Yeah, to say the least. But what I do find fascinating, like with the wooden bowl, he one day sees a young peasant boy drinking out of the river just using his hands, cupping the water. And he makes this pronounced, now famous quote that, I can't believe it. I've been living so superfluously, with all this extra baggage. And so he gets rid of his wooden bowl. So this is one possession.
That's great.
But it's an interesting lesson, I think, that Diogenes puts forward in front of us, this question of, to what extent do we as human beings create our own unhappiness? By creating this desire to want things that we don't really need or even want.
Right, and we're always looking for more.
There, right.
And we have that conversation at home, the difference between a need and something we want or desire.
And again, I don't want to go extreme on this. Right. I don't want to live in a clay pot down on Main Street. Although, during the summer it's probably not so bad. You have the concerts on the town square, and it'd be all right. Winter, a little more challenging.
For sure.
But I think it is a valuable lesson in challenging ourselves to think about, but what is that point of... And again, I don't know that I would draw that distinction between needs and wants. I hear that a lot, but if we're thinking about happiness and a true fulfilling life, some people will be very satisfied with just having needs met. Wants, however, I don't view it as a negative or any way evil thing. It's when they're out of balance.
When we're out of balance.
It gets excessive.
Exactly.
So
but when you need the sweater, Mama, I need it. Do you really need it, or do you have 30 sweaters in your closet at home? Or do you just really want it?
Well, and when you think about why you feel you want that, because it's usually not about the sweater.
No.
And so that's where we get into, well, what is it I'm really feeling is lacking in my life by buying that sweater?
Right. And am I really filling that void with that sweater?
Right.
What is causing that void?
Or as Diogenes would say, am I digging a deeper void?
Right.
By placing all these wants where they really weren't before.
Well, interestingly enough, I was at a conference last week, as you know, and there was a young college student involved in the AmeriCorps program, and he was up as a panel member speaking in front of the conference. And he said, I'm very hopeful for our future, but the one thing that terrifies me is when we put profit over people. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I'm talking about money with Maria on Monday, so I have to remember that. But it's interesting because we use this tool, but what happens when this tool becomes something more?
Well, you hit at the fact that there's not an endless supply of stuff.
Yeah.
And so suddenly, if we have to fight over whether it's a need or a want, the material things to fulfill that, it does start to pit human beings against each other.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about the research.
Yes, what does the research say about does money buy happiness?
Okay,
because we've learned growing up.
I heard over and over again.
Money is evil.
It cannot buy happiness.
Yeah.
I'll give you my good lawyer response.
Okay.
It depends. That's the response you can give to just about it. It depends.
That's great.
But it really applies here because the answer is not as simple as saying yes or no. What we find is in the research when it comes to currency or money, we have to look at it two different ways. First, if we talk about the quantity of money, how much money I make. The research seems to show that there is a point to which if you're increasing your paycheck, you will have a direct correlation with an increased level of happiness, but only up to a certain point. Most of the research settles that today in the United States around $75,000 annual salary. Some go as high as $80,000. We'll use the $75,000 figure for our purpose.
That's correlated then to your ability to pay your bills and live in the house.
And a little bit more than that, the wants. So just so we understand first what that means when we say it's correlated, it's kind of like if I have an increase in my paycheck, the number is going up. And let's say this hand is how happy I feel. For a while, this is going to happen. I see a bigger number on my paycheck. It's going up, my level of happiness is spiking. But eventually this is going to happen, and your level of happiness isn't going to directly correlate. It may still go up, but it's going to start to plateau and eventually it won't go up just because the paycheck's going up.
Because you can pay your bills comfortably, you can go on the vacation.
You can do basically the things you want to do.
But after that,
well, and when you think about buying things, it's sort of like developing an addiction. Right. That first car I buy, it can be a clunker, and I have a spike in happiness.
Oh, absolutely.
It's my first vehicle.
My 1985 Toyota Camry.
But notice what it's buying you, though. It's not really just that thing. It's the freedom.
It's buying you freedom.
And then suddenly, you kind of want your freedom to be a little more reliable, so you want to step up the vehicle. So it makes sense as we're stepping up
more
initially.
Than a tape deck.
There you go.
An AM, FM radio, dial radio.
But at what point is the car enough?
Yeah.
And that's where we see, by the time you're buying your fifth, your sixth vehicle, and especially if you buy the same vehicle, the spike in happiness is going to alter. You're not going to see that same reward. Do I need 2 vehicles? Do I need 3, 4? Eventually it plateaus because the stuff can't feed what I need as an individual.
Going back to what is that void?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So if we're approaching happiness based upon making more money, it's not a sustainable model. It'll work for a while, and that's what makes it attractive. And this is why I always challenge my college students to set their success number. Because most of them will admit at least one of the reasons, if not the driving reason why they're in college, they want a good job that's going to pay more money than what they're able to make right now.
Right.
And that makes sense,
Sure.
Because they're not at that $75,000 mark yet. When again, that's a rough estimate. It'll vary a little per person. But if you set your actual success mark, okay, if I want to make more money, I can't ever attain that because there's always more.
Right.
But if I say I want to eventually have a job that pays $80,000, $100,000, I mean, you set it something that is your success, then you know when you've attained that goal, and you also realize you're going to have to look for something else at that point because just attaining more money isn't going to necessarily make us happier.
Right.
I mean, you might have heard of the various research with the lottery winners.
Sure.
Some are happy, some are devastated.
Right.
It's the same thing. How are they using the money once they win that
So how
lottery?
we spend our money matters.
It matters a lot. And there's a complexity to how our societies operate, especially we're in a consumeristic society. It's not as simple as just having the money to buy stuff. I mentioned the lottery winners. It's probably worth discussing them a little bit. There's more to it than simply what I buy materialistically with those lottery, like I win millions. There's a mindset that goes with money. And one way of thinking about this, and I actually heard this at a presentation once, and I thought it was a fascinating way to view the economic classes. Because we tend to think of like the impoverished class according to a dollar amount, and middle class and upper class, that we even have these estimates as to when do you click into that. A lot of it's driven by our tax laws.
Right.
But if you think about it, there's so much more to these like economic class associations than just a dollar amount.
And there are mindsets associated.
There's direct mindsets.
Yeah.
So if you think about like you have your cup of coffee with you today, so food. If we're going to just use a really particular example of using money to buy food, if I'm in that impoverished class, I am looking at quantity. How much food? Because I'm hungry.
Right.
I just want to fill my stomach.
Yeah.
But if I move to the middle class, now I have the money to have enough food, so I'm not hungry. So I start thinking about
selecting which
kinds of food, the taste of it, the healthiness of it. Interestingly, 5-star restaurants are mostly middle class. It's not what we think of the upper class.
Yeah.
The perception of it.
Ruby Payne did a lot of work on this. And the book, Framework for Understanding Poverty, is a really wonderful resource talking about the mindsets of the classes. Yeah, and I remember my grandmother who lived through the Depression and she of course didn't need to, but she would dry out her paper towels after using them to save.
My mom has a lot of those things that she does because, again, she was a child during the Depression and remembers those days. But interesting with this food analogy, if you get to the upper class, it's not even about the food anymore.
Right.
It's presentation because they have plenty of money for the quantity. They have plenty of money to buy the good tasting food. So it becomes how you present it and the unique experience of the food, which is the second part of the research. We've been talking about the quantity. But the more important part is the experience that we buy with our money. What we do find is, regardless of how much money we have, if we're using our money to purchase experiences rather than material things, we have a higher level reported level of happiness.
So the family vacation is a great investment.
Exactly. And if you're going to buy things, if you buy them attached to experiences, that you have. In fact, I brought you a philosopher here. This, again, is probably not a real well-known philosopher. He's an Italian philosopher. Do you recognize him at all?
Well, you taught me about him already.
Do you remember his name?
Just before. I do not.
Okay.
Starts with an S.
Salvador Rosa.
Yeah,
He's an Italian philosopher. He's actually an artist first, but I always preface the philosophy for him. And there's a little Latin phrase down here that I absolutely love where it says, "Be quiet unless what you have to say is more important than silence." It's like, valuable lesson.
Yes, a great lesson.
But the reason I bring this is a painting, well, it's actually a print of an original painting that's hung in the National Gallery in London right now. And I could have just purchased this online. Okay, I could have bought it, purchased it online. I didn't. I actually went to London. It's when I discovered him as an artist and a philosopher. I was on a study abroad trip with a colleague of mine. We had about 18 philosophy students, and we were in the National Gallery. And my colleague, his name's Mark Thorsby, he's a colleague from Texas, we had this wonderful conversation. Neither of us had heard of him before this, so we followed it up with research. I bought the print there, but had it shipped back, so I didn't have to carry it all the way. And even though it would have been easy to just go online and purchase it, now this object has all these memories attached to it.
Part of that experience.
Right, and it's probably a good, valuable lesson for us to think about when we go on our family vacations. You know, choose your trinkets carefully because they can actually have this deep meaning with the experiences.
And every time you look at that item, it brings back those memories, those happy feelings.
Exactly. Yeah. And that really is the type of home to build, like where you go into your home and everywhere you look, it's these memories of great experiences. What a wonderful way to spend your money.
Absolutely. Yeah, on my dresser I have a jar of sand from our honeymoon. And every morning when I look at that jar, I think, oh, way back when, 14 years ago. But what a happy memory that was for me. And one of the first things I look at.
It brings it all back. Brings it all back. So, in conclusion, when we think about the question of can money buy happiness, the answer is really twofold. Yes, it can in quantity, how much money you make, up to roughly about $75,000 a year. You'll see a direct correlation to an increase in happiness. But probably the better recommended approach in life, use your money to buy experiences. Time with friends, time with family, and it's a much more sustainable usage of money.
Building those memories,